I worked at Rikers Island 25 years ago because my hospital, Montefiore in the Bronx, had a contract for over 20 years to provide health services at Rikers Island when it was a lot smaller, but it grew to its present size as a number of things with drugs and AIDS happened in the Bronx. But that was my graduate education in criminal justice. And I ran shrieking from it, frankly, and got more involved with AIDS because AIDS had come along at the same time, and that was something we could actually do something about, where our science made a difference, where we could, we did a pretty good job on AIDS, which was heavily involved in the drug injecting issue, the way in which overdose is now. And you keep seeing these manifestations of the poor quality of our drug policies in this country that led to mass incarceration, that have led to this overdose epidemic we have now, 55,000 deaths last year. At the height of the crack epidemic, it was about 7,000, give you a sense of scale. And the new profile of overdoses is people who get involved in it through pain medication, which they become addicted to, and then suddenly there's a black market that comes to meet them, heroin market all over the United States now, especially in New England and in the American South. So, for a behavioral scientist, epidemiologist I am, what are your tools to deal with this? Because the facts of it don't really persuade people because there's an attachment to this system of punishment. Surveys of punitiveness in America still continue to give very, very unpleasant ratings about attitudes, about the death penalty, about punishment. But if you look at those results and the populations they relate to carefully, what you see is the history of racism in our criminal justice policy. So many of you may know my friend and colleague's book, New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I have the fortune of having given her the number that she needed to do this, which was there were as many slaves at the beginning of the Civil War in 1860 as there are African-American men in the criminal justice system now, jail, prison, and parole and probation, probably even more than that. So you get a sense of the scale and people have some understanding that slavery was a terrible thing for us to have done, and we still haven't made reparations or even shown remorse about it in this society. And that's a big deal because the victims of it are still there. There's another movie called The 13th, which you may have seen, which relates to the 13th Amendment that Lincoln signed a week or two before he was assassinated to free the slaves. And it has in it this clause that the 13th Amendment, that except for convicted criminals, where there's no obligation to, because it begins bondage and, what's the exact wording? Does anyone have it? Huh? Bondage and slavery and involuntary servitude, and immediately goes to the except for criminals who've been duly due process and convicted, that it was okay to exempt them from the end of slavery. And it's amazing that that was explicit in 1865. And because it disappeared from sight. I didn't hear anything about it myself. Maybe the lawyers here had been looking at the wording of these amendments. I hadn't. But it turns out to be the backbone of the system, because everything we see about the way the prison system has evolved with non-white people is very consistent with the rule of slavery. Impunity, absolute unaccountability to do anything. And it was driven by the economic structure that slavery had in American society. That hasn't been acknowledged, that hasn't been compensated. Instead, you have the prison system, which is another jobs program based on the punishment of black people in America. And that has to be faced up to squarely. I don't see a way out of this without doing that, because if the kinds of treatment that takes place in jails and prisons was happening to white people in this country, there'd be a different story about it. There'd be a different accountability about it. We all know that. And so to face this issue, and that's what's so great about this film, The 13th, Ava DuVernay, who made it, is it focuses very clearly on those issues, and it provides the groundwork for each piece of it. If Glenn Martin is about to do a leadership program that'll be in the communities that have so many former prisoners in them. For New York City, for example, 6 communities in New York provide 85% of all the prisoners in the state prison system in New York. And those communities, for every person in prison, from every person who's in prison from those communities, the $1 million blocks that Glenn mentioned, there are 5 or 6 who have been in prison, maybe more than that, actually. And they live in the communities they came from, because where else would they go? And those communities need to be transformed into places that can heal the wounds of the system we've created for punishment, and educate people, the kids in those communities that are at very high risk. The child of a prisoner now, born now, African-American male prisoner person in the United States, close to 40% lifetime risk of imprisonment in the population. And if you take away the high school diploma, look, it gets up to 80%. Very, very, very high rates pulled out of these communities. And in New York, we know which those communities are. And they have to be healed, those communities. They have to have programs, not only for the drug problems that continue to rave, because we don't really do justice to drug treatment. We have effective treatments now for every one of the addictive drugs, actually. And they involve using other drugs called medication-assisted treatment. It turns out that cannabis, marijuana, is one of the most effective agents for treating addictions, not alcohol, cocaine, heroin, would you believe. And we have a phenomenon that the states that have medical marijuana have 30 to 40% lower rates of overdose from opiates, because the cannabis that's out there for people to use modulates the risks of using opiate-based painkillers. Finally, I think that if we can begin to recognize the value of the people who are coming out of prison, violent, many of whom are going to have committed violent offenses, and recognize that those people did something crazy, terrible when they were 16, 18, 20 years old for the most part. It's that kind. And they served 30 years in prison and come out of that often the strongest people. If it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. And Glenn's leadership group has the potential, over 200 trained people now, to go back to those communities and take a leadership role in the areas that have been abandoned by the rest of the community, the education of these populations, job programs, and psychotherapy and drug treatment. So they're very, very straightforward things to be done, but they got to be done. You can't just talk about them. And they cost incredibly less than the jail and the prison. Glenn's figure of over $200,000 a year per bed in Rikers Island, to keep people in that torturous situation, to recognize that this is Torture Island at this point. Call it what it is, stop being polite about it. Because the criminalization and the demonization of the criminals, the criminalized, especially black man in this society, the Willie Horton syndrome, we have to confront that. And it's going to be a job. I'm part of a project in the American South now, because we're focusing on that, because they have the worst rates of every problem: AIDS, drugs, overdose deaths, and incarceration. They go together. We call it the Southern Syndemic. And the idea here is to begin to simultaneously take on those issues. But it's not going to happen out of the federal government, this one we have now. It's not going to happen out of most southern state governments. It's going to happen from the people themselves and the public health and medical programs. We've created a collaboration of the historically black medical schools and colleges in the South and all the public health schools in the South. And we're going to begin to create a regional program, which will hopefully leap past the state level where you can't get anything done in the South. They're busy fighting about the Confederate flag. But the professions that are involved, the health professions, the public health professions, the mental health professions, social work, have a lot to offer. And if we work together and let Bill Gates give us money the way he gives it outside the country, and we can take care of, you know how many people there are in the South? 80 million. It's not a small population. and we could address that population and make substantial gains in their life expectancy and the quality of their life, and look after their children, and we'd see the result. If you monitor these things as you go along, if you set as an epidemiologist, if you set in place the measures to keep track of the important variables, how long children live, the adverse childhood events, these trauma measures. Trauma-informed discourse is the new buzzword in most social service training. So if we just begin to do our jobs professionally, as we've done in medicine. You see, medicine, because it's in the laboratory and has wonder drugs, can get away with this. In the behavioral and social sciences and public health, it's much harder. You have to have a public will to do it. But I think there's room there to take the skills that we do have and the educational people that are there, the leadership people, and begin to make that our job and do it. We're going to have to do it outside of government. Thank you.